Hello, I'm so happy to be with you today. I'm Darren Walker. I am a brown skinned African American man with a bald head, lucite framed glasses, a navy blazer, blue shirt. I'm sitting in my office at the Ford Foundation, and I am so happy to welcome you to Ideas at Ford, a conversation with my friend, Anne Marie Slaughter. Anne Marie Slaughter has written a fantastic book, Renewal. This book is the work that reflects years of introspection, of lived experience, and truly authentic, candid, honest observations. And so I want to welcome my friend, Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter, to Ideas at Ford.
Darren, it's such a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. So I'm Anne Marie Slaughter. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a white woman with sort of chin-length brown hair. I'm wearing a periwinkle shirt, and I am sitting in a hotel room, so my background is blurred, and all you can see is me.
Well, seeing you is what I want to do today, because I want to talk about this book, which truly, Anne Marie, you pour your heart out in this book. It's profound in so many ways. The way in which you give us visibility in your sort of inner being, and the depth of experiences, the experiences of deep questioning of your leadership, of reflection, and a feeling of insecurity that you failed at various stages in what has been an exceptionally, extraordinarily successful career. And yet you talk about these things. And so we're going to get to Renewal. But I have to say, because, you know, the first book of yours that I read was the work that you did on work, indeed, called Unfinished Business in 2015. And did you know, when you wrote this book and you talked about the care economy and care as a sector, and it was a marginal idea. I mean, besides you and Ai-jen Poo, there really were not national leaders talking about this. And here we are in the midst of debates on the Hill, and the care economy is normative.
I have to say, it's just, I didn't expect it. I did find that in, you know, reasoning through what gender equality was going to take, it became clearer and clearer to me that you couldn't have gender equality if you only valued traditional men's work and didn't value traditional women's work. And traditional women's work was care, very broadly defined, really investing in other people and nurturing them and enabling them to grow. But at the time, yes, Ai-jen Poo was way ahead, I think, of all of us, talking about the care is the work that makes all other work possible. That's always been her line. But most of my fellow feminists were very uncomfortable with the whole frame. I mean, there'd always been a group of women pushing for paid family leave and childcare and elder care, but that was not as glamorous as the career feminism of, you know, Gloria Steinem's feminism, which is hugely important. I wouldn't be sitting here if it hadn't been for that movement. But it's extraordinary to see, and you know that at Ford, you've seen this happen with a lot of ideas, that over the last 6 years, the notion that care is the umbrella for all this work, and that a society that doesn't enable its people to care for one another is a society that is both blind and deficient and really in many ways morally bankrupt, is becoming more and more mainstream, more on the left, but not only on the left, because an awful lot of women in particular on the right have wanted their own care work valued for a very long time.
Well, congratulations, because regardless of what happens on the Hill in the coming weeks, this is not going away from the discourse on our economy in the future. So kudos to you and Ajin and all the other women who have been working on the front lines on this issue for years. Now, I want to get to renewal because this is a book that is both diagnostic and solutions focused. And you also, though, sort of telescope within you a lot of it. And then you spend the second half of the book sort of telescoping out and talking about our nation and who we are as a people and the ways in which we need to come together and how that can happen. But let's start at where really the book begins, which is a really very jarring opening, because you write in the introduction, when you talk about leadership means having to say you're sorry, and you talk about the opening sentence, it was the worst day of my professional life. Your professional life has been superlative. I mean, you're here you are, Harvard Law, PhD, your many academic achievements, dean of the prestigious Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, right hand of Secretary Hillary Clinton at the State Department. And here you are on this day saying it was the worst day of my professional life. Why was that?
Well, it's funny, my stomach still tightens when I think about it after living through it and writing about it. And look, there are plenty of people in the world who've gone through worse crises, but it really was a crisis where I, as leader of New America, had been accused of letting somebody go because we'd been pressured by a funder. That wasn't true, but it kind of didn't matter because I had made a number of real errors in how I addressed it, how I handled it. The result was my organization was being pilloried in the press, and the reputation that we depended on was at risk. And I wasn't the only person responsible, but I was the leader, and it would have been perfectly reasonable at that point for my board to decide, we need somebody else. So for me, it was this moment of really sort of existential self-examination and realizing that I had imperiled an organization I cared about. And I start there partly because I want people to identify on a personal basis. I don't want this to be a policy book. I want this to be a book that a wider group of people will read, but also because this is a book about a learning journey. And that was the beginning of the learning journey. And I talk about David Bradley, whom you and I both know, telling you to run toward the criticism. And I figure if I can't be honest about my own learning journey, then how on earth is the country or any organization actually going to be able to take that advice? If I can't model it, then I have no business writing about it.
And you write about it for whom? Because I know a big part of your following have been feminists, other women, but it sounds like your goal here is to reach more than just women. And do you feel you've been able to do that?
Yes. So my goal is to reach as widely as I possibly can. But one of the things I have learned so vividly, and it's a lesson I relearn all the time, is to be deeply conscious of who the we is, particularly when someone like me, who is white and affluent and privileged.
Well, and you had to have learned that from your famous or infamous, amazing 10,000 word article on You Can't Have It All. I believe it was that the Atlantic, or where you published this whole idea that you can't have it all, or can you? And I just remember the the tumult, the collective convulsion going on across elite feminist circles around your article. You had to have learned something from that.
I did. And the first thing I learned, yes, it was the Atlantic. It was why women still can't have it all. And it was really about what it's going to take for everybody to have it all, although I don't use the frame anymore. But the first thing I learned going on the road was my version of feminism was, it was the feminist mystique. It was Betty Friedan. It was white, suburban, affluent feminism. And that African-American women who listened to me, or anybody who had, really had come from a working class background, said my mother never sat around and worried about wanting to fulfill herself. My mother was working, and African-American women didn't have the chance often to raise their own children. So that was definitely my first lesson in being very careful about the we. And in this book, I think also when I talk about radical honesty, and I talk about looking in the mirror and seeing not just what you want to see, but what others see, I'm much more careful depending on whom I'm talking to. Obviously, there are many people who look in the mirror and they see themselves, and society sees them in very distorted and biased ways. I'm not going to tell them that they should accommodate what other people see. So I'm trying to reach as many people as possible, but also to be very careful about the limits of my own ability to generalize my experience.
Right, but there is something about being able to, and you get to this later, being able to write in a way that unifies people, that does speak to people. And even though you may not authentically know what an African-American working class woman's day-to-day life is, you should be able, and you can, and I think the book does speak to her.
I think so. I think in part being aware of the limits of your experience, but also looking for the cross-cutting dimensions, right? So to that woman, we might have a very different background, but we might both be mothers. We might both deeply have exactly that same sense when our kids are out and we're worried about them, or we might, both aspire to create beauty in the world, right? There's so many cross-cutting identities. And I do believe, particularly if you are very authentic and very honest, that can often be a pathway. Or, that woman may feel also vulnerable in various ways. And I've had lots of women, but also interestingly, a number of men write me after reading this book and say, you really captured my experience. And a lot of these are men, who are leaders you and I both know, who you would look at and think, they don't have a care in the world. But of course, we all have those cares.
And speaking of cares, and also holding the mirror up, and as you say, self-examination, the part where you talk about the Princeton experience, because of course you were close to the president of Princeton, and when Chris Paxton, your successor, went on to be president of Brown, the normative protocol, which would have made sense, would have been to call you as the prior dean and to have you come on an interim basis until the new dean was chosen. And you waited for the call from your dear Princeton, and it never came. The way you describe how you felt in that moment is riveting and is rich and profound and deep. Talk about that. I mean, for someone always on the fast track, always succeeding, always being the straight A, perfect student, highly admired, regarded academic, to not get the call from the president of Princeton must have been devastating.
It was hard. I mean, again, I'm always, this is not the worst thing that can happen to anybody, and I didn't
What's the
particularly
worst
want
thing
to.
that could happen to
It
an
was pretty
elite
bad.
woman who's been
It
dean
was.
before? Yeah.
It was. It was. I didn't particularly want to be interim dean, but I sure wanted to be asked. I expected to be asked, and what I
Like
wrote.
it would be.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I wrote about that is that when I had this crisis in 2017, I had to really then say, wait a minute, I can justify this. We can always justify what happens in the moment. But if I'm going to be radically honest, and that's one of the sort of
Yeah,
points of the book, is this
that book is about, the chapter is about radical honesty.
radical honesty, then I need to look back and ask myself, is there a pattern here? Because this is not the first time that my self-perception and the perception of others has diverged. And although, again, I'm trained as a lawyer, as are you, I can make plenty of arguments about how I was right and others were wrong. If I'm really going to learn something, I have got to go back. And I went back and talked to Shirley Tillman, the president, and said, okay, why? Tell me what was wrong. And she told me things, some of which, I could say, well, that doesn't quite sound right. But a lot of which I had to say, there's something there. Had I spent more time with people, had I given up more of the spotlight, which is something, as a woman leader, there's sexism there, but it was a woman telling
that to men.
I know, but Shirley Tillman is an extraordinary leader. So, I really did. I really did learn something. And the point is, and part of the point of why I'm willing to write about it, is that in the end, I think that kind of introspection and honesty makes you stronger and more confident. I would never be willing to sort of draw aside the veil to that extent if I were still feeling vulnerable and shaken, and it's been 4 years since this process. But I do believe this in many ways is what many of us have to go through. Many of us in our organizations, young people are saying, hey, wait a minute, the racism isn't out there, it's in here. And many people like me respond with, no, not me. But if you really look hard and you're willing to kind of say, well, maybe what I'm so certain of isn't right, then you start to learn. And the same, I think, is true of the country. I mean, obviously, I don't stand for the country, but I think there are patterns here and insights and processes that are at least analogous.
Yeah, and I want to get to that in a moment, but I want to talk about this idea that you talk about risk, and risk taking is very hard for a lot of people, and of course, as you repeatedly point out in the book, a privileged upper class white woman like yourself, the idea of taking risk is different than a lower income woman of color who's got, literally lives week to week and has no safety net. But this idea of risk and how, as a society, we've got to be able and equipped and resilient in the future. As you write, you talk about this idea of de-risking must be replaced by welcoming uncertainty. This idea of welcoming uncertainty is very problematic, Anne-Marie. I mean, our brains aren't wired. We like predictability, in spite of the fact that we might complain about our predictable marriages, our predictable day-to-day and whatever. We like that, actually. And the world in which we're moving into in this sort of post-COVID, or at least living with COVID world, is one where uncertainty, ambiguity, unpredictable, living more with more precarity is going to be a reality, and that's very hard.
It is. I mean, I think there are personalities that handle it better than others, but all of us, as you say, routine, is comforting. A measure of predictability is comforting. Indeed, I think if you look at the current sort of mental health crisis that the United States and other countries are going through, the combination of COVID, economic precarity as a result of COVID, and constant catastrophic weather, so that we feel that the sort of Damocles of climate change is hanging over our heads, is exactly this sense of just having really the ground under you moving and shaking. And obviously, I think individual psyches, you try to find what will make you feel safer. But I do think we have to try to prepare our children, our mentees, the young people in our lives to kind of roll with it. I always think of, surfing, or, my mother's line to me was always, make like a stone in the river and let the water just, run over you when things get overwhelming. But I also think, and this is the lesson of sort of the paradox of risk and security, we have to make it so that people aren't going to fall that far, because we're not going to be able to predict and plan. We're going to have to be able to respond and adapt. And if you're going to have to respond and adapt, partly you want to build up sort of reserves of resilience. And actually, Darren, I quote you in the book as talking about resilience as being a we phenomenon, not just a you phenomenon, that we need to build the strength of relationships and ways of then knowing that we've got resilience. But as a society, the only way people are going to be able to really flourish and take risks in this environment is to know not just a safety net, because that's, safety net has lots of holes in it. We really need to build a new social foundation that give people some measure of certainty in a radically uncertain world. That if they lose their job, they really are going to be able to retrain. That if, they can't pay their rent, they're not going to be kicked out on the street. And above all, that they've got health insurance. And that should include mental health insurance. But that, if something happens, they are not going to lose their livelihood to medical bills.
Right. I think this part of the book is really powerful. And the part of the book in which you refer to my experience talking about Head Start and the collective we, was really this notion of that you start to you build up to this idea of the kind of e pluribus unum, this notion that we are one. And you, I think, explicate very well the tension between our identities. And because some identities, some people have been underrepresented, have been marginalized, the assertion and claiming of those identities with pride, and the tension that arises from that with our more important and cohesive idea of an American identity, and how challenging that is, and how these ideas are now being played out in everything from the absurd debates around critical race theory to someone recently telling me that the Ford Foundation has perpetrated since the 1960s identity politics to great harm in America, which of course is ridiculous because identity politics was codified in our Constitution.
I
read it, but Ford Foundation did not create identity politics. But the point is, there is a real tension, if we're to be honest, with this idea of our American identity, the collective we, and our sense of pride that I should be able to feel as an African American and assert that in the public commons in ways in which my forebears could not do. And that tension is real. And I think you try to get at the underbelly of that, and the challenges, and then how we actually talk about that, the way you underscore that.
At the end of the book, I talk about my imaginary 2026, what's going to happen on the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the beginning of our second quarter millennium as a nation, when we will not be majority white, we will be a plurality nation. And I say, I imagine the president signing a bill that says, or an executive order, but probably a bill that says, henceforth our motto will not be e pluribus unum, out of many one. It will be pluris et unum, many and one. And I had to have my Latin checked because it's been a long time since I took Latin, but that's what it is, pluris et unum. But I think this is really important for the nation that we have to become if we're going to hang together as a nation, which is really both and thinking. Secretary Clinton always said it's not either or, it's both and. And I'll give you an example. President Biden just declared October 11th as Indigenous Peoples Day. But he rightly talked about what Indigenous peoples have gone through and what we still owe them. And then he also issued a proclamation celebrating October, the second Monday in October, which is congressionally mandated, as Columbus Day, and wrote about Italian Americans. I think many Americans today do not realize that Italian Americans and Irish Americans were discriminated against, and that for them, Columbus Day really meant something. That's both and. Right? You can be absolutely aware of all the things that Columbus perpetrated when he landed, and the whole idea that Columbus discovered this country, when obviously you had millions of Indigenous Americans already living here, or hundreds of thousands. But you don't always have to choose. You really can say, our identity as a country is that we reflect the world, and that we are bound together by a civic faith and by ideals that we constantly fall short of, but we strive for. And at the same time, you can celebrate your heritage as an African-American man, and I can celebrate mine as half Belgian and half Virginian and North Carolinian or whatever. And increasingly, Americans will have so many different parts.
But I think I have to intervene here because, both and thinking is not what many people you and I know see. It is not both and. I mean, I a few years ago, the wonderful honor of chairing when the mayor decided to kick down the curb the idea of what to do about Columbus Day and what to do about Columbus Circle and the things here in New York. And we had citywide testimony, and there were the overwhelming view, particularly from progressives, was not a both and, was that any reference in a positive way about Columbus needed to be expunged. And so I agree with you that both and I agree with you that we need to embrace that complexity, because that complexity is the American narrative.
Yeah.
And the challenge is, I believe, we have these vectors of, on the one hand, either evil or this romanticized. Going back to your home state of Virginia and the way you write about visiting Monticello in your book, those Virginians and the cult, and them.
I know them.
Starting with the historians who continue to propagate this myth of Jefferson. Okay, so there's the mythology of Jefferson, and that's not right either. And then there's the Jefferson was evil, take down his statue, and that's not right either. And yet, those are the two vectors that are controlling the dialogue about Jefferson, when the reality is he was a complicated genius who was a hypocrite and a racist and a misogynist and all those things. And he was brilliant. And he wrote some of the most compelling words ever to be written about the potential of humankind to form a democratic ideal, right? So all of that complexity we need to embrace, but that complexity, that nuance, is not what people want to hear. It's
No,
much harder to, and so I find, and your book, you do end with this optimistic, I think aspirational idea of what we will become. But I think a lot of people are really challenged by that. A lot of people don't want to hear that. A couple of years ago, when there was all the messaging around, this is the last class of first graders who will be predominantly white. And, there was the trumpeting of that. Well, for a lot of Americans, that was not good news, right? So you and I see that as the continuing evolution of this remarkable, amazing country. And as you say here in your book, for a lot of Americans, they don't want to look back on those things that are uncomfortable, distasteful, inconsistent with the romanticized idea of America. They want to just look forward, but they want to hold on to those historical narratives that actually hold us back and don't allow us to live in the both and world.
look, I agree with everything you say. And again, it's one of the reasons I felt that I had to write the book, I actually do think we're at a moment of real peril as a nation, because we are going to be the first democracy that has moved from a clear white majority, dominant white majority, 80%, to a plurality nation. Obviously, there are countries like India that have been plural. I mean, there is a dominant majority, but it's a very diverse country. And Britain is supposed to do the same thing by 2050. So we're not going to be alone. But can we navigate something that, yes, many white people feel very afraid of, and many other people feel like, look, it's not as simple as it's our turn, but it's, wait a minute, now we have to be heard. Now our version of history has to be heard. So I do really believe that those of us who do want to see both and, who want to say, this is just not so simple. And indeed, if you read Amanda Ripley on high conflict, how do you de-escalate conflict? It is to complicate the narrative. It is to make clear that we have multiple identities, that it's not so simple. In Clint Smith's wonderful book, How the Word is Passed, he talks about the African-American woman who was the head of the Oral History Project at Monticello, who says, and she can trace her ancestry back to enslaved people, probably some of whom Jefferson owned, but she also is a graduate of the University of Virginia, which he founded, and which continues now to be a university that is changing radically. I think we have to insist that the kind of purity of no compromise it's the luxury of those who don't actually have to be in the arena and make it work. And there are going to be different solutions. Some statues of Columbus will be taken down. Others will stay up and they'll be put in context. Confederate statues, I'm really clear that, look, those are folks who, fought for war, even though a lot of them are my ancestors. Who unquestionably a huge part of it was to maintain the subjugation of another race. No, I'm perfectly happy with taking those down. But others, there's not going to be one solution. But I do think, as hard as it is to stand up and say, no, it's not as simple as just, that moral certainty of knowing that you're right and this is clearly wrong, that will not get us. It will not move us forward as a nation. And ultimately, you have to remember, if you want to make the transition from a dominant white power structure to something that's truly diverse, you've really got to make sure that the very folks who are certain that their time has come are not the folks who are most hurt.
So listen, I want to go to questions because I know there are questions from the audience, and my wonderful colleague is going to open the floor. Questions to Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter, president of New America Foundation.
Thank you, Darren. Dr. Slaughter, our first question. When discussing honest feedback, which formats or ways have you found most productive?
Was the question which formats or ways?
Yes. Have you found
Yes.
most productive for discussing honest feedback?
Yeah. So this is something that as a CEO and as a manager at New America, we talk about it a lot, and we talk about having a culture of constructive feedback, fearless feedback. I have to say that I think the easiest way to give it is to be asked to give it. And this is, again, I model that in the book where I go to my former boss and I say, look, I need you to tell me what was good, but more importantly, what was bad. I called all 20 board members and asked the same thing, because as much as we want to be, very honest, Kim Clark's Scott's book is called Radical Candor. If somebody doesn't want to hear it, it is incredibly hard to give. And so I think the best thing to do is to create a culture in which you convince younger people, and I would say this to my children and my mentees as well, they will grow if they ask for it. And if they can learn to take it in a way that really is, I'm going to be better. And that's the theory of grit. That's Angela Duckworth. But I think relying only on managers to be courageous enough to say, yes, you did this well, but you didn't do that, without the person helping open that door, is hard. It shouldn't only be on the person, who's getting the feedback, but that person should learn to open the door. And then it's much easier for the person who's giving the feedback to blend it in such a way that it can be heard and acted on.
Thanks, Katie.
Great. So our next question is, Dr. Slaughter, you mentioned the problem of the purity of no compromise, but it seems that the political divide is getting wider and the culture of no compromise is everywhere. How do you think we can start to move towards compromise and bridge some of these divides in the US?
We could start by getting rid of social media, which I know is not going to happen, but I really do believe that this culture that we now understand, that the algorithms of Facebook, for instance, and many other social media platforms do drive us to extremes. And I've seen it. I've been on Twitter since 2011, and it used to be a place where you could actually engage with people. Now it's all, who can stake out the most militant or snarky or sometimes hateful ground. I don't believe that actually what we see on social media or even the polls reflects the complexity of what a lot of people feel. I think, for instance, if we had a multi-party system, we would have 4 to 6 parties, and there would be areas of overlap. I think if we can talk to each other as people, we are not necessarily going to find common ground. I was reading Krista Tippett on this morning. You may not find common ground, but you will find respect for one another as humans. Not everybody. I mean, I certainly, there are people who are beyond the pale for me without any question, but there are a lot of folks who I am always going to disagree with politically, whom I can see as human beings that I can engage with. And sometimes I'm just going to win if it's a majority vote. Sometimes there will be compromises that don't mean we all agree, but mean I get something that I want and they get something that they want. If we can't do that, I really am worried that, the country could once again turn to violence. It's happened before. And it wouldn't look like the Civil War of 1860, but it wouldn't be pretty. So I think there's a lot at stake here in learning how not to demonize one another. And I do believe there's a lot of evidence, if you read Maureen Common's work, for instance, that there are more people in this country who want to find a way to move forward than we see in the media.
Thank you. So our next question is, the pandemic has changed a lot for all of us. What unique opportunities do you see for reimagining how people work and how we all think about work?
Ha. Well, I write about this in the book and talk about, I really do think we're going to move toward a 4-day work week or a 32-hour work week. I don't know how that's going to be. That may be working 4 days. It may be working 6-hour days. There are all sorts of different combinations, but people forget that at the turn of the 20th century, people worked 16-hour days. Right, 12 to 14 to 16-hour days. It's Henry Ford who's, innovates actually with the 8-hour day. And people didn't used to have weekends. If you take away weekends, there would be riots. But no, you might have had Sunday as your day of rest. You certainly didn't get Saturday off. So there's absolutely nothing written that says we cannot actually have 32 much more productive hours. I also think it's going to be, and this is a long process of probably a decade, 2 decades, where we find a blend of coming together and then also working remotely. Now, obviously, this is only possible right now for jobs that can be done partly digitally. But an awful lot of the jobs that our essential workers held during the pandemic, a lot of those jobs are already getting automated away, and a lot of people don't want them. So where I see us going is a world in which you have multiple streams of work. You work less for paid income, but of course you've got care work and all sorts of other work that are work. And that there is a way where many, many more people can live and work in the same place without still coming together some of the time, but without this, daily commute of the 9 to 5 that has been basically the industrial workday, that we are now moving to what I would call the digital workday.
And do you think, Anne Marie, again, going back to the we, who are we talking about? I mean, I find that a lot of these conversations are being driven by the priorities and desires of a sort of a middle level, a higher. I mean, these are not the people I worry about, quite candidly. I mean, the people I worry about really mostly are those vulnerable workers who are at risk both of automation or of exploitation. I mean, I think so, I again, going back to, the African American woman who is in a service sector job, these conversations about what does the work week look like, and here's my desire for the kind of lifestyle I want to live, and here's my expectations of these various benefits, et cetera. I find that that's an abstraction to many of working class and poor people who work and are still low income in this country. That's not the conversation they're having. Do they go in 4 days or 3 days or have? I mean, again, maybe I'm being too pessimistic here, but I just don't. I find that, again, that is a senior people are going to be being in the office more, but I don't know. I really struggle with calibrating how much of that conversation should dominate. And again, I understand why it's dominating. The big resignation is real. I understand why the media, certainly the elite media, the audience are people like you and me and others who have the privilege of being in a conversation about, an expectation of just when I should come to the office and the terms and conditions of what my remote or flexible work actually looks like.
So, Darren, I mean, of course you're right. Although I still think, going back to 16-hour days versus 8-hour days, there's kind of a norm, and whatever that norm is set is going to ripple through. But the kinds of jobs you're talking about, what I immediately think of is those are jobs where people are working 2 to 3 of them, right? Service
Yep,
jobs of different kinds. So
absolutely.
you have fast food, and then, hours as a security guard, or, then driving Uber or Lyft for the rest of the time. And they're still not making a living wage. Right. So when I look at that kind of work, I want to start over in the sense of we aren't going to be able to deliver on any of our promises or our self-identity of, the American dream, and you can come here and make it, in a generation or two. Absolutely not. You are mired in sort of intergenerational poverty where you're working incredibly hard and you're still not making ahead of it. So part of what I'm saying is a lot of those jobs, the fast food kinds of jobs, are going to disappear. So what are we going to do? No, we're not going to assume that the people who had those jobs are suddenly going to sit in front of a computer all day. What we do have to be thinking of is, what are the good jobs that where you can work? Maybe you don't work a 32-hour, maybe you work a 40 or 50-hour week, but you absolutely can actually get ahead. So to me, that entire sector of the economy needs a whole different set of prescriptions. And it can't be addressed by, how many sort of an average work week. It has to be addressed by recognizing that we've got a permanent working poor, and that is wrong. And again, a lot of those jobs are going to disappear. So there's going to be an opportunity. The question is whether we can seize it politically.
Thanks. Katie.
So our next question is, what advice would you give to young women scholars who are interested in academic leadership? What did you find most useful and effective in your own journey? And what would you have done differently along the way?
Well, what was unquestionably the most useful in my own journey was that the University of Chicago Law School had a 3-year tenure track. And that meant that even though I started late, I mean, I went on the teaching market when I was 32, I could be tenured by 35 and then start trying to have kids. As it was, and I've written about this, I left it late and I spent 3 years trying to have our first child. But the 6-year tenure track, the 8-year tenure track makes it almost impossible. So honestly, what I think we have to advocate for, and again, tenure is under siege also, and I don't want to abolish it, but the tenure track was created for men, white men, but who had a full-time caregiver at home. And if that's true, yes, you can write 2 books in 7 years or however many articles your department wants you to write. If you are the caregiver, and this is true for men as well as women, but it's still more true of women, no. But there's no reason it has to be done in 5 to 7 or years, right? You should be able to come up for tenure when you want to and when you are ready to, within some guidelines. For those folks who cannot get tenure before you have kids, and there is a real tension here, because I do also advise younger women to try to have kids before they're 35 because their fertility is much higher. And if you have to freeze your eggs, that's not a solution. And it's extremely expensive, but if you can, you probably should. It's a systemic issue that we've got to tackle at the level of university leadership, where you recognize if you maintain this system, you will simply continue to have a tremendous, equal numbers of men and women starting out in all your fields, even harder in the hard sciences. And the women will drop off because we are expecting things of them that we do not expect of men, and that frankly don't make any sense.
Last question for Dr. Slaughter.
At the moment, things seem very overwhelming with the pandemic and climate change in the economy. Is there anything that you're hopeful about?
This book ends on a hopeful note. I am hopeful that we can in fact make really big change. And partly I'm hopeful because if you go back and read history at the end of the 19th century, even in the teens and certainly in the 30s. We look back and say, oh, Franklin Roosevelt implemented the New Deal. It was a near thing. It was, I mean, there were, the Supreme Court kept striking it down. There was absolutely no guarantee that we would get to a very different society in terms of our political system and our economic system. And I do believe that this deep crisis we're in is ultimately either going to really put us into, kind of disintegration, which is what we have to fight against, or the only way out is really big change. And it's not just reforms. It's really remaking our electoral system so that we can have multiple parties. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we only have two parties. The founders didn't believe in any parties, which was naive, but still. Or there's nothing that says that education has to be a function of property taxes, right? That is path dependent, and we are going to lose in the world if we continue that. We are not going to unlock the talent that we have. Or having an entire infrastructure of care. As Darren said, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that was just not even a frame. And, it may not succeed this time, but it will stay there. I think part of it will succeed this time. We just may not get everything that we need. So I do believe in the sort of ability of this country to gather and do big things. And the other thing that gives me hope is the diversity of our younger generations. I look at that and I think, this is the country that we are. And to me, it is just so profoundly powerful and moving to see generations who look like the world, who don't just look like Europe and Africa, but who really reflect the world. It's tumultuous, but it does give me great hope.
Well, thank you, Anne Marie Slaughter, President and CEO of New America Foundation, because renewal gives me hope. I'm so grateful that you wrote this book. I commend it to all of our viewers today. It is a great read. It will leave you feeling better and hopeful and optimistic about our future. So thank you again. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the year, Ideas at Ford. On November 9th, we have Dr. Gillian Tett, her book, Anthrovision. December 8th, Rob Reich and Mehran Sahami, their book, System Era. And we'll end the year, my dear friend Indra Nooyi, on December 13th with her book, My Life in Full. Thank you all for being with us today at Ideas at Ford, and we will see you on November 9th. Thank you.